Welcome, everybody, to Real Solutions, a podcast series on policies for a future where everyone belongs. The Othering and Belonging Institute is hosting this podcast series with leaders from across the country to uplift and insist on bold policy solutions that would move the country towards belonging and well being for all people.
This episode focuses on a real solution that reimagines our response to disasters and how we build community resilience in the face of those disasters and how people's homes are insured. We're recording this 1 year after the Eaton fire in LA destroyed thousands of homes. And before that, some of the residents had already found that their policies had been canceled as companies were leaving the state or cutting people off. And in the follow up to the fire, people found that insurance companies were failing to help them recover.
And it's important to note that climate change is already costing US households up to $900 per year, amounting to tens of billions of dollars in extra cost annually. More than half of those added expenses come through rising insurance premiums, especially in disaster prone zones.
So today we're joined by two leaders working with impacted communities to advance real solutions to these issues. Moira Burse is a senior fellow at Climate and Communities Institute and the lead author of Shared Fates, a housing resilience policy vision for the home insurance crisis, and other research and policy proposals on the home insurance crisis.
And we're also joined by Sierra Cos, who is the co founder and co executive director of Extreme Weather Survivors and filmmaker, advertising creative and presidential campaign veteran.
Enjoy the show.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Real Solutions Podcast, a podcast put on by the Othering and Belonging Institute, where we talk about real problems and propose real solutions. And also, Happy New Year to everyone that is listening. Happy 2026. Y bebe, it is a wild year, but a lot of people out there proposing false solutions to real problems. And so we're back with another episode of Real Solutions. This episode is a very special episode in many ways. We are recording this episode very close, right after the 1 year anniversary of the LA fires. And as someone who is born and raised in Los Angeles, it hits home. Though I was in South Central, to be part of, to be born and raised in the city, to care about Los Angeles and its in its entirety and its community, it's important for all of us to come together. So want to give a huge shout out to survivors of the fires. And also this conversation, more than anything, is about being a little bit proactive and trying to figure out like what is happening, what the hell are insurance companies doing? Because this is not the first and only disaster we'll be having. And with that, we are both joined today by Sierra and Moira. Good morning. And Eli is also right here. And I'll just dive in straight into the questions because I feel like we have so much to talk about that we'll just jump in. And so with every question, of course, we're talking not just about real policy solutions, and we're also talking about some of the values that underlie it, right? And the shifts that need to happen, and also engaging a bit with the imagination. And so we'll start there. So I'm going to ask you to imagine a future of good living where people experiencing a disaster could count on a fair and effective insurance to support them in recovering from that disaster. What would that look like? And what might it feel like to be someone living in that good living world, in that good future?
It's interesting because I just spent yesterday in LA with our LA fire survivor community, both from Altadena and the Palisades. We put together a community event and art installation, and one of the real goals for the event was really that to bring the broader Angelino community together in community with fire survivors, because I guess a bit of what I had said to the group was we need to help fire survivors who are still in the thick of it. 7 in 10 fire survivors are still not home or in a permanent housing situation. There are still really, really incredibly tough things people are up against. But what I said to the room, which was also largely a ton of just Angelinos not directly impacted, was we need to support fire survivors, not just because it's the morally right thing to do, not just because the city of LA will not recover if we can't show up better for those communities, but also they're giving us a gift here. Truly, they are screaming from the rooftops that the insurance system is broken, that our federal government is not deploying funds. And, the science tells us we are entering a new era of bigger and stronger and more costly and more deadly disasters. And so when fire survivors are saying this is broken, we should be standing with them and advocating with them and voting with them, not just because it's the right thing to do, but also because, you know, you don't know, you may be the next person hit by a fire or a flood or a hurricane, because that's the new reality we're living in. I might have bounced around a bit from your question, but I just wanted to share that I've really been reflecting a lot on the 1 year anniversary. Um, I think when you talk about what would it look like in sort of a utopian universe, I really think about a few things. You know, I think as Americans, we assume that we pay into our insurance company. We're required to have, upon buying a home, and that sort of contract, that actual contract, that if we pay on time for decades, that when something happens, we will be covered. And that's just not the reality that survivors are dealing with right now. There certainly are a few survivors who have been paid out on time, but a number of the things that we hear are just the sheer number of people being given, 7 to 10 new adjusters, a total lack of clarity from their insurance companies about why they may be getting denied. And living expenses that are supposed to be covered when your house has been destroyed, those living expenses not matching up with both inflation or the realities of what families need to live in LA when rental costs skyrocket after an event like this. And so I think one of the things I would look for is really just, there are ways in which the insurance company in particular, there's this vision we have of what is the way that insurance should be rolled out, and that's currently not happening. And so a positive example may be that after a disaster, you lose your home, you have one, maybe two adjusters that you're working with. So you're not having to explain explain your situation all over again. That you're not having to itemize your items in a way that is nearly impossible, because how can you remember how many sunglasses you had after you've lost everything, right? How can you truly know every single item in your home? And transparency, having an understanding of, if my claim is being denied, why it's being denied, and an actual timeline and understanding of when payment will come, and why it may be held up. Those are just a few things that I would name.
I too am in California, although in the Bay Area. And so yeah, wildfire is the disaster that feels the closest. Although probably also I should be thinking about earthquake. But yeah, just imagining a fire in my in the Oakland Hills near where I live, and let's imagine I live in the impact area. There's a fire that ripped through as soon as the governor declared a state of emergency. My insurance provider, maybe it's not a company, but my insurance provider calls me or sends me a text or whatever, and says, is your home been affected? And when I affirm that it has, I immediately get some funds to my account to cover the immediate needs of maybe some temporary living situations, or what have you. Maybe I haven't suffered a total loss. It's just some windows being blown out by the heat, say. And so, my home isn't totally destroyed, but I can't live in my bedroom because I have no windows, right? I can't stay at home, but I get that immediate support for finding a hotel to stay in. But then, part of the reason my home hasn't been totally destroyed is that before the disaster even hit, the state, a housing resilience entity of the state had been in my neighborhood and had, which had been identified, by risk mapping as high risk. And they had come and they had cut down, brush that was flammable. They'd helped me and my neighbors clear trees and other risky things around our houses, also in the local park. And so the fire mostly skirted our neighborhood because we had reduced that risk beforehand. Right. And so it could have been much worse, but it wasn't. And for me, that vision of that proactive support, that's community oriented, that's really thinking about how we're all connected, right? That wildfires aren't just going to hit my home, they're going to hit my whole community. And so how are we taking care of each other, I think is so essential to this vision too.
Sierra, you started to talk about some of the problems in people's lives as they're dealing with the Eaton fire or other disasters, floods, hurricanes, earthquakes, and then the challenges that people are having with the recovery and the insurance companies. Let's get more into that to really understand the scope of the problem and the depth of it. You all have done amazing work to record people's stories, and it seems like this might be a good moment to play some of those testimonies, to hear directly from some of the people who've experienced it. So why don't we cue up some of those stories, and then you can reflect on them.
It was a shock, but dealing with the insurance company is 100 times more devastating and stressful and crushing, because you feel so powerless against these companies.
I would say that my experience with my insurance company and adjuster and the Department of Insurance has been more traumatic than the fire itself.
We've moved 22 times since January, all due to the fact that State Farm would not approve our temporary housing. My son, my youngest, he's having a hard time dealing with all of this.
I feel dehumanized. I feel like I'm a case number. I feel like people don't remember that on the other end of their phone is me, who just lost my fucking house. Every community of fire survivors that we've gotten to speak to or gotten kind of adopted into is, I go from kind of shock and frustration and disbelief of like, wait a second, how are they saying they just don't cover our car under fire circumstances? And you just kind of see these like knowing nods from all the people who've had it before. They're like, yeah. And it always makes me go, like, then why was I paying so much every month for insurance that wasn't going to pay me back?
I've never in my life been a litigious person, ever. Whoever wronged me, whatever, I was like, you know what, I don't want to waste my time with negative stuff. I rather cut the loss and move on. I've reached a point where I want to sue everyone that makes my life hell, or has been making my life hell, and has taken time away from my child that only has me.
When we first started this organization, I didn't envision that we would be working on insurance. And it's not just in California. We hear these same sentiments truly in Vermont, in Florida, in Texas, this is a systemic problem. And I worked a while back more in the sort of communication side on Obamacare. And it really does remind me of some of these same systemic issues where the industry has gotten to a place where, they're incentivized to keep as much money as possible. And we really do need accountability to say, we are paying into this system, and it's not okay. It's just not okay to keep people in a never-ending loop of, this woman I spoke to in LA recently said to me, that the number of letters she's gotten saying, we're reviewing your claim, we're reviewing your claim, we're reviewing your claim. And there's just not transparency. And so we really do need, and this is not a partisan issue. I mean, truly, like, this is Americans writ large are impacted by this, and I would just say it feels most urgent to me right now in California, because I really feel like the number one question with whether or not a survivor would answer if they are on the road to recovery is what insurance company they have and whether or not there have been payouts. Like, that's really, like, it is the roadblock. And so I do think we have an urgency in California, but it's their same urgency as elsewhere. I'm sure Moira could speak to that. And I think in addition, this is coming to a head with these malpractices or sort of illegal practices from the insurance company at the exact same time where we're breaking records every single year in the costs of these disasters and the number of these disasters, and novel things, right? Like football-sized hail that's breaking cars all over Minnesota and Iowa. So yeah, it's urgent.
If I may briefly, thank you for playing the audio. The survivor that talked about. Now I just want to sue everybody. I was like, girl, you and but a little bit of me. I think that the urgency in itself as well is, I think, and I may be wrong. Well, no, I believe it. I think that there is a paradigm shift that we're experiencing. There is a false promise, or what has always been a false promise from insurance companies. And when we start talking a little bit about the underlying issue, right? There's this waking up of being like, okay, there is some sort of like codependency that we have to systems in general across issues. And I think a lot of what happened and what we saw in the in the surviving phase and in those efforts was the interdependence of community. And so in my mind, I'm thinking, of course, let's get to that paradigm shift where we go from being codependent into systems and interdependent on one another. And truly, some cool things can happen there. But I feel the survivor was like, I want to sue everybody. I was like, girl, you sue them and I'll punch them for you.
I have this great story of there's someone who voted for Trump in our network. And he doesn't say climate change. He says global warming, and he talks about it totally different than maybe someone else would. But there's this power. I'm sure, Moira, you hear this. There's this powerlessness that people feel that is just these huge behemoth companies. Our elected officials are not holding them accountable, and you're just in this maze of feeling powerless. And this person who voted for Trump, who's our network, said this great quote just about how, you guys think I'm just the little guy. Well, I'm telling you, I am not going to stop. I am going to keep fighting you. You think you're going to break me. You're not going to break me. And so I think we are starting to see that there's connections across different communities in this country going, this isn't fair. I paid.
No, 100%. And as we're now setting the stage and talking about it, I'm curious, Amoy, if I can ask you, who was hit the hardest by these problems, right? We know the baseline is going to look different across many different communities for X amount of reasons. And so I'm curious, can we talk a little bit about who's hit the hardest by these problems, and how does the harm ripple out to affect others? Kind of here going back to that interconnectedness, right? Hopefully we can help illuminate a little bit more of what that looks like.
Yeah, well, absolutely. This problem is affecting folks across the country, different communities, income levels, races, all types of folks. And as is often the case, the poor and working class are among the hardest hit, right? If they are fortunate enough to be homeowners, they've maybe had to cut back on coverage to even afford their premiums. And so when disaster hits, they're really left with financial ruin, right? Because even if they had the best insurance company that was doing the best claims payout process, they didn't have enough coverage to begin with, right? Or maybe their scarce resources have meant that they've had to move to one of the more risky places because that's where they can afford to live. Here in California, for example, we have some of the highest cost of living prices in the country in our cities. And so to be able to afford places to live, many folks are moving into those more rural areas, which is where there's more wildfire risk, right? Or if folks are renters, which of course is primarily, poor and working class folks, their renters insurance prices are going up, and or their rent might be going up because their landlord's insurance premiums are also rising given this insurance crisis. And we're also even hearing in our research from housing developers, especially of the most affordable housing units, that they're even reconsidering doing new housing because of these rising insurance costs. So that's going to squeeze our housing availability and affordability even more. Plus, right, we also have communities of color who are directly impacted by this, often in disproportionate ways, right? We have, unfortunately, in this country, a long legacy of discriminatory housing practices, from things like redlining and forcing folks to live in some of the more risky areas, like flood zones are some of the places where, particularly in the South, where communities of color, particularly Black communities, have been sort of pushed into living in those places, and now those are the riskiest spots, and so those communities are even more vulnerable.
This is a specific sort of niche topic, but it's one that I had not known about until I got into this work, and it really is a horrific situation for families whose home is still standing. They would call it, partial loss, smoke damage. There's any number of terms, but oftentimes, if you are of some level of means, especially if you have children, your insurance company may tell you, oh, it's totally safe to move back in. There's lead, arsenic, they send some bogus tester, and it's like, it's a clean report. And then you pay for a private testing, and it's, horrific, toxic chemicals in your home. And I think if you have means, you look at that and go, well, we're not going to move back. We will just eat the cost and do remediation or cleaning. And what we're hearing from some of the lower income families in our network is there's literally just not an option. And so they have to move back. And that's when we're looking at like a humanitarian public health crisis, because we just don't know this level of an urban fire and the things that were burned. And so I know that's a one-off, but I just think there's probably just thousands of examples like that.
I think what you're getting at here, if I may, that there is an underlying analysis of who's disproportionately hit the hardest when we're thinking about like risk areas, when we're thinking about the disaster in itself, but you're pointing to the aftermath, right? And the recovery process. And then even in the journey of grief, of surviving, that's also still going to look disproportionate, like you just mentioned, right? There's some communities that have no option but to move back under extreme and dangerous conditions where others can do that. So I think, thank you for pointing that out. It's a nuance that I think we don't talk about enough, and being like, yes, there is, this risk and where you're living and all those different things. And also the process of surviving is going to look different. So thank you for bringing that up too.
I want to get us into talking about why these systems are so broken and what the current policy failures are. I'm just thinking about the fact that it's been 20 years since Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast. And we all saw how devastating that was and how flawed the recovery has been. And so this isn't a mystery or like new information. So can you help us understand why the kind of broken systems are so entrenched?
Yeah, so we've really given insurance companies enormous power over this essential tool of insurance that really underpins so much of how housing finance and disaster response works in this country. But it's essential to remember, right, that insurance companies are first and foremost companies, so they have a profit mandate, right? And their first priority is always going to be making profit for their shareholders or their owners. Right. And so the well-being of policyholders like us, households, is going to be secondary to that profit motive. Right. And so that's why we're seeing insurance companies doing everything they can to raise premium rates to cherry pick what they see as the best policies, to threaten to leave if they don't get deregulation, and to really nickel and dime policyholders on their claims so they can make as much money as possible, right? In other words, our current insurance system prioritizes the profits for industry rather than protection for households. And unfortunately, current policy approaches, for the most part, are really kind of focused on, okay, how do we rescue the insurance industry? How do we entice them back in? And it's really like, how can we help them keep making tons of money? and to my mind, that isn't where we should be focusing our energy and our policy and our advocacy, right? Particularly, that ignores this profit motive. And in this era where climate change is making disasters more frequent and more severe, we really need to enact policies that make our housing safer from disasters and really have that safety net for households when the disasters do inevitably strike. And I think sometimes folks think, oh, well, insurers have to pay claims after a disaster, so aren't they incentivized to reduce the risk from damage from those disasters? But clearly no, because we're not seeing that happen. And it makes sense, right? If you think about the fact that, right, the insurance companies prioritize the short term, right? These policies are 1 year, sometimes even less. So that's short term. They have quarterly earnings reports, right, where they're reporting to their shareholders on a quarterly basis, super short term. And, they know that, like, you could, after your policy's up or even in the middle of it, you could go to some other insurance company. And so they're disincentivized actually to do any kind of investment in that risk reduction, making our housing safer. So there's really this structural mismatch between who's responsible and who benefits from risk reduction. So we really need to rethink it.
Could I just ask a question that I've wondered that seems sort of like naive but obvious? Why haven't the insurance companies gone to war with the fossil fuel industry that's causing climate change? Like, the fossil fuel industry is just raining down risk and costs that is going to land on insurance holders.
Well, I think primarily it's two things. One is this short-term thing, right? They're like, well, we can still make some money in the short term, and we can pick and choose the best policies, and we can do all this nickel and diming like I was just describing. So they really do think in these short-term ways. And also, a lot of insurance companies, the way that insurance companies make the bulk of their profit is actually through investing some of that premium income in bonds and stocks and whatnot. And so they're interested in fossil fuel companies doing well. Some of them invest directly in fossil fuel companies and the ways that fossil fuels are part of bond markets and index funds, stock index funds, and all of that. And so it's actually not really in their interest to go after the fossil fuel companies.
And just, if you are listening and if you are pissed off right now, please be so. Please be so. What Maura just let us realize is that at the end of the day, people are just pawns in the game of chess. You see what I'm saying? Like, the obvious answer, I think, to Eli's question is for insurance companies to some way and to some extent, right, be advocates of the people that they're representing and being like, y'all are legit out here fucking us over with all this risk that now got to pay out all this damn money to all these people because y'all keep doing this business. Like, y'all need to calm this shit down. Sorry, I get so mad. People know at this point. But
No,
like, that's but go ahead, Sierra.
No, I would just encourage, there's an organization called Center for Climate Integrity. And I know that I believe it's them that had I'll try to find it so you can add it to the show notes, that had put out some really interesting statistics or research just around how heavily invested insurance companies are in oil and gas, and just that marriage then. And there were some really interesting laws that tried to get passed. There was one in Texas where it didn't pass, but where they were literally, some lawmakers were trying to prevent insurance companies to include climate change sort of mapping or predictions or research in their prices or in their, and the insurance companies clearly fought it because they were like, No, like this is science, and we're aware that there's ways that you can determine what are higher risk and all of that sort of stuff.
I think one of the things we've been talking a lot about this podcast and letting people know at home and as they're listening is like, yes, we're talking about policy solutions and, that are very real, that are tangible, that are making change. And we also want folks to understand that behind that policy, there's some sort of thinking, there is an approach to how we treat one another. There's a value system behind it. So I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about what is it about the value system and thinking of this current system that is also flawed?
The values undergirding this system really are that public goods, these things that we as a society and as communities need, can be adequately provided by profit-seeking actors, right? We see the failure of this logic in a bunch of areas. Healthcare, we already mentioned that. Electricity provision, right? Our PG&Es and our utilities, and home insurance is no exception. And every time that insurance companies think their profits might be threatened, they withdraw or threaten to do so. This is not the first time that this kind of thing has happened, right? We saw this in the mid-1960s when insurers across the country stopped covering floods. That's why we have the National Flood Insurance Program. And we also saw it again in the late 1960s when they stopped providing insurance in inner cities in the wake of urban uprisings, and of course in the context of redlining and housing discrimination, right? And so disaster risk, like the increasing disaster risk we're seeing these days because of climate change, causes a lot of profit uncertainty for them. And so it's really no surprise that private insurers are hedging their bets at this moment. But that's no way to ensure an essential service like home insurance, right? One that is like required for all homeowners that have a mortgage, required for apartment building owners, for landlords to have a mortgage, things like that. And so it's no way to ensure that this essential service is affordable and available.
There is that paradigm shift that is happening, and maybe in some weird way the strength and sort of the frequency of these disasters, I think folks are starting to realize like, oh girl, like this is now the new normal, or this is what the world is going to be like looking moving forward. So this is no longer working, so how do we reimagine this, you know what I mean? And I think part of that conversation has been inspired also hearing from other policy solutions across different issue areas. And now I'm just starting to imagine like, girl, this is why we need a wealth tax, and some of that wealth tax just goes to like a insurance fund that is administered and like by a community that's a business improvement district. Do we need like a climate improvement district or climate resilience district? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, let's get into the policy ideas. One of the reasons we were excited to have you on the podcast is because the work you've done on this idea of a housing resilience agency that really kind of reimagines how communities insure themselves and recover from disasters. Can you talk about what that idea is and how it would work?
Yeah, so colleagues at the Climate and Community Institute and I spent about a year doing research, talking to survivors and organizers and advocates and researchers, and building upon work that others had already done to come up with this idea of states setting up what we called housing resilience agencies. And the idea is that this would be a state institution that would both provide public disaster insurance for all households, while also carrying out the essential work across the state to really reduce the risk of damage to housing from disasters. So really key to the functioning of the Housing Resilience Agency, the HRA, would be ensuring that residents and housing providers, and residents of all types, right? Renters, people who live in mobile homes, live in condos, single family homes, duplexes, what have you, right? We need to be thinking about the whole suite of households, really. And that there is access to effective, affordable insurance protection at the same time that the state is really implementing comprehensive risk reduction to limit damage before disaster strikes. I talked earlier about the vision of the state program having come to my neighborhood to help the whole community reduce fire risk. That's the kind of thing that we need, right? And it's also key, and this speaks back to our mention of the fossil fuel industry earlier, it's also really key to requiring polluters and corporate profiteers that cause this crisis to help pay for the solution, right? So we think that means, among other examples, that those fossil fuel companies whose business model, as we've said, has driven this increase in severity and frequency of extreme weather events are paying in, are contributing. And that also, frankly, the insurance industry that has financed and underwritten fossil fuels and that has, of course, nickel and dimed us so much that they're also contributing to this better system. And we also think it means thinking about, okay, what are the entities that really stand to benefit from a more stable and functional home insurance system? And so, top of mind for me in that is the mortgage lenders, right? If there aren't insurable properties for them to make a loan on, their business model disappears. They need this as well as households. So it shouldn't just be households who are paying. It should be also some of these entities like mortgage lenders who are who need this and should put some skin in the game.
You mentioned a little bit about that vision of folks coming down, from the state program and kind of being there. See, social workers are needed everywhere because that's like a social work thing, case management and assessment. But sorry, how else could this show up in people's lives? I think it's so much also as we're proposing these real solutions to audience members, we want to also kind of see what that looks like in the lived experience so that folks can begin to really articulate that vision and then know that it's not just some policy numbers and vote, be beyond the bureaucracies of what it is, but what does it actually look like? So do you mind diving a little bit deeper, expanding upon that vision you started off with?
One of the ways we can imagine this working, right, is that the state sets up a public disaster insurance program. It's actually similar to how New Zealand does their disaster insurance. And so you're still going to get your home insurance policy if you're a homeowner from private insurance company, but there's more regulation and consumer protections that they have to adhere to, right? About paying your claims faster, not using discriminatory metrics like credit report to set your rate, which currently happens in a lot of places. But you have a single policy that covers that standard stuff like your kitchen fires and maybe your burglaries that the insurance company covers. And then attached to that policy is coverage from the state that covers all the disasters, so that that when there's a big disaster, it's the state, it's our democratically elected institutions that are going to respond to that. And then in the meantime, like we've talked about, the state is doing an assessment of where is there the most risk, how are we helping these communities reduce that risk, whether it's like we talked about the fire reduction, maybe it's doing earthquake retrofits, maybe it's some new sewer systems to deal with flooding. You of course, depending on the place, it's going to look like a different thing, but essential to it is that it's community oriented. Right? Because we are so connected. What my neighbor does is going to affect me. If I live in a hurricane prone area and my neighbor hasn't fixed their roof to withstand high winds, it might fly off and smash into my house. And then I'm screwed, right? And so we need to be thinking in these holistic ways because we really are connected. Our fates are shared. And then it also means that accountability and responsibility that we're placing on some of these institutions that are responsible or that have a stake in this as well.
There are people in our community that have already lost their home to a fire and are rebuilding, or our community down in San Diego that we work with that have had mass flooding from atmospheric rivers. They want to invest in making changes to their homes or doing things that could help mitigate against another destructive event. But this stuff is expensive, and the private insurance companies aren't always, coming through with either discounts or mainly it's discounts when people do make that investment. And so we really do need to change the incentive structure because, like I said, it helps all of us. And so, I just wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah, thanks, Sierra. And I think it is essential to note that incentives aren't enough, right? Unless you have a lot of money, you can't pay upfront for doing some of these changes. And so we can't just rely on, maybe you'll get $50 off your insurance premium if you invest $10,000 in a new roof. Like that doesn't compute for most people. And so that's why we really need a more collective approach to this that really actually makes it work and is effective, because these incentives clearly aren't. And I'll just name Jose and Eli can say if they want to get into this in detail or not. But one of the problems I see with our current system is that we essentially assume that the price of your insurance premium is enough to both make clear what you need to do and assumes that you can afford it and incentivizes you to make your home safe. And I think that is so flawed because, of course, people make decisions about where they live and what they spend their money on for a whole host of reasons, if they even have money to spend. And also, it assumes that these are individual problems. But we're talking about major catastrophes. These aren't it's not something I caused or you caused. It's not something I can totally make go away, nor can you. Right? These are collective problems, and so we really need to be taking a more collective approach.
I wonder if you can talk about some of the examples of maybe this policy doesn't exist exactly as you're proposing, but you mentioned New Zealand. Are there other places or versions of this that we can learn from?
Across the world, there are examples of different ways to organize responses to disaster insurance. New Zealand, Spain, Switzerland, Japan, countries around the world have developed different approaches. I think that the New Zealand model in particular is an inspiration and was definitely an inspiration for our thinking about the Housing Resilience Agency. So there, every residence with a standard home insurance policy has basically a rider attached to it that gives them coverage up to a cap for this government provided insurance for a predefined set of large-scale disasters like wildfires, earthquakes, and storms. And that coverage is paid for by a standard fee. There they call it a levy. I guess that's a New Zealand term. And property owners can also buy disaster insurance directly from the government if they don't have one of those standard policies for whatever reason. And interestingly and importantly, I think New Zealand also has a Bill of Rights for policyholders that sets out the standard of service that a homeowner can expect to receive from that program and a clear mechanism for independent review where people can submit complaints. And I think that's really essential. I mean, to expect of a government program, but also that's the kind of thing that we need to expect from private insurers, right? That there's a standard that they need to be held to.
Yeah, that's so important to lift up. I mean, a lot of people haven't had good experience with public programs and don't trust government. We've also been fed the message that government is the problem for so long that there's just a general bias against something being run by the government. So those kind of protections of a Bill of Rights and independent review are the type of public systems that would make sure that any sort of public agency is transparent and accountable. Sierra, do you have any thoughts on those examples?
There's two things I would just love to call out because they just got announced yesterday. This is solving for urgently needed gaps in the system right now. But on the anniversary, I'm sorry, I don't remember specifically which elected put forward these two policies, but there's in California, there's SB 877, the Fair Claims Practices and Transparency Act. And that in particular would require transparency and accountability and loss estimates documentation so that homeowners can sort of clearly see how their payout was calculated, what changes were made by who, and just allow survivors to verify the accuracy, challenge errors, and access the sort of the benefits that they paid for. Again, and this is like chipping at the issue, but I would just name in the short term, there are some policies being put forward that when Moira's speaking of these, like, insurance bill of rights or just things that really could force better or fair practices for the insurance companies as they currently exist in California. The other one that I was really inspired by is SB 878. So that is an Insurance Payment Accountability Act, which strengthens existing prompt payment insurance laws by imposing sort of penalties, interest penalties, when insurers do that thing of just, your claim is being reviewed, your claim is being reviewed. And they insist on sort of when there's delays, it incurs penalties on the insurance company in hopes to sort of end some of that that just waiting game that they've put people on. So while there obviously is really hopeful, broad systemic policy being put forward by Moira, I just wanted to call out, even in the short term, there are some things that people can be organizing around to just sort of strengthen what we're currently living with, which is really also critically important for the people that are just living it day in, day out. So I would mention those, and if folks that are listening are interested in sort of mobilizing and organizing those, it was brought forward largely by a friend of ours named Joy Chen at the Eaton Fire Survivor Network. You can, I'll in the show notes, I'll give their website. But they really, these are policies that they've identified as things that are critically needed for what they're up against. But as I mentioned previously, like, survivors today that have lost a home and are living through this are really providing a gift to the rest of us living in California, saying you could be next, and stand with us and organize around these things so that the private insurance system is working more fairly.
Thank you for that, both of you. As we are unfortunately getting toward the end of the episode, and in this sort of last act of the episode, we want to talk a little bit about, Moira, you started mentioning the Housing Resiliency Agency, and again, as we're talking about the paradigm shift, we'll talk a little bit about some of the vision and the values in that, and then just so folks are aware as well, for folks who are listening where we are in the episode, then we'll start talking about actualizing something like this solution, this policy solution. So I'll go back to the first question and thinking, what are some of the values about something like the Housing Resiliency Agency and in that paradigm shift, right? How is it shifting from the current system that we've already talked about that being flawed? And so, what is this new vision and or the new values that we're asking folks to lean into?
Fundamentally, the policy centers people, not insurance companies, and I think that's essential, whether it comes to these sort of bigger, how are we changing the system, transformative types of policies that I'm talking about, or whether it's the kind of short-term measures to help people in the now that Sierra is talking about, which are absolutely important as well. The priority has to be, and the value has to be, how are we helping people, right? And unfortunately, that isn't always the case from some of the policy proposals and solutions that get put forward. At CCI, we talk about how the orientation of any approach to this insurance crisis needs to be, how do we increase safety and resilience for all households? And the tools of insurance have a role to play in that, but insurance companies should not be the center of that policy. And relatedly, right, we've talked about this a bit already, but part of the solution here is also understanding that our fates are shared, particularly when we're talking about these extreme weather disasters that climate change is making more severe and more frequent. And it's also interesting because this actually connects directly to good insurance design, right? Good insurance design actually requires pulling together a ton of different policyholders with different exposures to types, levels, timelines, and geographies of risk. So actually, the best insurance policy is diverse in those ways, brings us all together into a community of fate, and so let's lean into that.
One thing I'd love to close on is just insurance companies and the system writ large benefits when individuals are isolated, when individuals feel their inability to get their payout, the way they've been treated that's unfair, or any of the number of ways that we've named how insurance is currently not working for Americans. They benefit by us being silent and not being organized. And so going back to my background and just belief in raising our stories, there really is power in sharing your insurance story online, even if you don't have a huge following. If you have an insurance story that you want to share, when people share publicly their insurance story, especially if they add a hashtag insurance crisis, we're able to make it clear that this is a systemic problem, that you're not alone, that this is happening amongst many people. And it allows us truly to hold these insurance companies' feet to the fire, and then also look for broader, more systemic insurance change. And I would just, one plug I'd love to add, Extreme Weather Survivors is a nationwide organization. We are going to be having an advocacy summit on February 28th. And in that advocacy summit, it'll be digital. And a lot of what we do is we'll actually bring forward individuals who have been actually successful at sort of pushing back against insurance companies, some of the tactics they deployed, some really interesting things like, targeted LinkedIn ads naming their insurance company and an insurance commissioner, and then they ended up resulting in a payout. And so we're gonna in that, I just urge you, if you're interested in getting involved, if you're directly impacted or just care about this topic and want to learn more about how we can create change, follow us on Extreme Weather Survivors on Instagram, and there's a link for how to sign up for the Advocacy Summit. And really pleased to announce, I believe Lucy McBath is actually going to be sort of opening that session for the individuals. So I think it is a good opportunity. Yeah, and the other thing that I would name that I think that's maybe hopeful, that I think that I've seen in my work in the last couple of years, is we build digital communities where we connect survivors of different disasters across different states and cities to one another. And there's just this incredible organizing happening where people who have State Farm in one area who are connecting with other people who have had State Farm in another area and saying, this is what they told me. Is this what they told you? And there's this ability to, like, just grassroots connecting with one another to try to fight back and learn more and more about how to navigate these complex issues. And through that sort of, no one wants this expert knowledge at navigating FEMA or insurance paperwork. But what we often hear is, I went through hell and back dealing with this. And if this expert knowledge that I now have can be useful for the next person going through it, it's healing for me to be connected. And so that's another place where I would just name, I found that hopeful, because I think those are the communities that are going to work with folks like Moira to really be able to elevate our voices and say, this is a crisis, it's not working for us, and we want something different.
If there was one thing that you would change about how people think about and learn about disaster insurance and community resilience, what would that be? What would you lift up?
I think it's that connection, it's that community, it's that we're in this together piece, right? We often think about insurance as, oh, it's my insurance policy, it's my contract with the insurance company, it's me against them. But insurance is collective, right? I mean, it brings us all together. It says, when you need help, you should get it. When I need help, I should get it. And my putting in is helping you when you need it, and you putting in is helping me when I need it. And that kind of mutual aid approach, we really need to keep front of mind when we're thinking about this issue. That collective orientation is particularly relevant, right, when we're talking about these big disasters, because none of us cause these well, unless we're like the CEO of Exxon, none of us cause this, and none of us can deal with it alone. And so that organizing that Sierra is talking about, that coming together that Sierra is talking about, and the recognizing that this touches on issues of housing justice, land use policy, tenants' rights, environmental protection, fighting climate change, like all these different advocacy and organizing communities can come together and work together on this. And it's a really powerful connecting tool, I think.
I think one thing is that I learned last year with a bill that died in committee. I learned there's these threats that both oil companies or honestly, most corporations make, right? Like, we're gonna pull out of California, or we're gonna, these type of threats, or your gas prices will go up. They're just not true. They're not based in fact. And so I think one thing I just love to do is name that corporations have become really good at figuring out a threat that can pit us against each other and sort of argue that it, there is just not, those things just aren't based in reality, especially in California, the biggest insurance market in the country, right? Like and then I think the second thing is just around, and I said this at the top, but I think it's worth repeating. There's a gentleman we interviewed in LA from Altadena, Dwan, and he said to me, if you think a fire will never burn down your house, that it's impossible, let me tell you that you are wrong, because I thought the same thing and it happened to me. And I know that that's kind of a downer, but if you think for a fact that your insurance company has you covered and should something happen, you will be fine. That's just not the reality based on the facts of what we hear from the community. And so these people that are really in it, that are having to battle their insurance companies right now, they are giving us a gift by saying, the system is broken. So can you stand with us and can you organize with us now? Because it's also self-interested. It could, if we can fix the system, it will be there for you too.
Thank you so much to both of you for those closing thoughts and so well articulated. And if you in casita is like, but I'm not even a homeowner, I don't even have insurance, what does it even mean? I want you to focus on the power analysis of the conversation we just had today. We are calling it an insurance company, but at the end of the day, I think we can all agree that we're talking about corporations. And we're talking about corporations in the way that they're playing false promises and the codependency that we as people and as a society have in place. And we could trace back, from like a sociological, anthropological lens, why we do this and why this country has been fed to do that. And so whether it's insurance or not, I think the game and the audacity that a lot of these insurance companies and so corporations as a whole are having, I think folks are starting to wake up to that. And Moira, you said it beautifully, in that collective orientation in our shared fate. There's a lot more shared fate than we think that there isn't. And we're seeing corporations working very hard at distilling and tethering that collective fate. But amigas, is there. And all I can say in 2026, if corporations are going to be audacious, so should we. That's all I'll say. I felt inspired. Sorry, I got mad. I always get mad in these episodes, but not in a bad way. But I'm just like ready and fired up.
We filmed a video just at the time. Many insurance companies were arguing for really astronomical rate hikes. I think one request was at 33%. And so if you wanted to play that video, I think it's interesting because some of these survivors said it better than I ever could, which was, elected officials keep acting like we can keep rate hiking our way out of this, and we can't.
Let's play that video, Mark, if you could cue the video.
Both sides of my family have been in Altadena for over 40 years.
When we found ourselves in the position to finally buy a house, we found a really beautiful little spot. It was small, but it was what we needed.
My wife and I had a coffee shop in Altadena. It was where we got most of our livelihood from. If everything went downhill, we would have this still.
So the scope of the personal loss is still larger than I've been able to fully comprehend.
Those increasingly common billion-dollar storms have led to an insurance crisis, with rising rates making coverage unaffordable to many Americans, and some companies pulling out of states like Florida and California altogether.
We lost our house completely in the Eaton fire. It was burned to the ground with everything that we owned inside of it.
The house is gone. I mean, it didn't take any time.
We lost everything. We just got what we were wearing that day. Nothing else.
I used to have a home, and I used to have an idea of what my life was going to look like. That's the real loss.
We're not numbers. We are not invisible. We're human beings.
I have no idea how the insurance companies can stay solvent under these conditions, with all these disasters happening one after the other.
I don't think the current system of insurance is sustainable at all.
They're all about the numbers. So why are they leaving? It's because the frequency of these disasters.
These disasters are happening with more frequency. It's not even a question. These giant oil and gas companies, it's exactly what they predicted was going to happen 15 years ago, 20 years ago.
The companies that have contributed the most to the emissions that have contributed to global warming should have a large part into rectifying the damage that they've done.
I just imagine in a couple more years how other things are going to be.
This isn't going away.
It might be useful to mention too that here in California, in Georgia, in states across the country, there are elections for insurance commissioner this year. Now, a lot of the changes we need are big policy changes that probably require legislative fixes as well. But this is a moment when we can be calling for and supporting political leadership that actually is putting people first, not insurance companies, that is actually seeking how to respond to immediate needs that people have and also pursuing these bigger systemic fixes. So that's another thing that people can sink their teeth into when it comes to how to fix this.
Welcome back, and we really hope you enjoyed this episode. Again, I think more than anything, the timeliness of the episode, given the 1 year anniversary of the fires, and also the urgency that was discussed in this episode is very important to note because we all know that there's no going back now. This is now, like we mentioned in other OBI programming, right? We now are fighting forward not only through different political, geopolitical landscapes, but also different climate landscapes. And with that, we've arrived to our last episode of this series. How do you feel, Eli, after recording and talking about 6 different real policy solutions?
Feeling good. I think it's just powerful to hear that there's such great thought and organizing behind real solutions to all these different issues. And I hope that folks have appreciated how we got into depth on them and the kind of breadth, cutting across different issues, different communities, different parts of the country, trying to lift up some of the most inspiring and positive work. And obviously not covering all of the solutions to all of the problems, but lifting up some important ones that are worth advancing. And really excited for this next conversation, this next episode, where we're going to bring together speakers from all of the different episodes to talk about some of the intersections between these different policies and what it looks like to organize for them together.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I also just want to say thank you to the listeners. Thank you to you all. We have heard from you all via Facebook messages, Instagram messages, or emails about the impact that these conversations have had in the way that you are thinking about your everyday life. So we are grateful. We are committed to this journey. And like Eli mentioned, these aren't all the policy solutions. There are a couple, and we are definitely committed to figuring out how the hell do we put these policy solutions into action. And with that, we want to say thank you again and also save the date for that final conversation on February 5th at 2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time.